What I'm going to do this morning is just give you a kind of a brief review of what happened at the Northeast meeting several weeks ago when they met in Manchester, New Hampshire. And they had set up a half-day session with the objective of addressing bridge preservation research needs from their viewpoint up in the Northeast. And there was another objective too, which I'm going to touch on first. Is anybody familiar with this document? Does it look like something you may have seen somewhere? This is a roadmap that was developed, sponsored by Federal Highway back in 06-07, and this document was published in January of 2008. And it contains, well, as you saw there, 25 research problem statements related to bridge preservation. And one of the objectives that we built into the session 2 of the Northeast Bridge Preservation meeting was to go take a look at those statements from the viewpoint of their current perspective now, discuss them a little bit, and then give them a rating on a scale which I'll show you in a minute. And this is one of the ways we're trying to take a look back at the map and see whether or not the contents of that map are still relevant today, which is like 8 years later after it was published. So as I mentioned, there were 25 statements on the bridge side in that document. They were broken down into these categories here. And each one of those statements is a full research problem statement, all the way from title down through estimated cost and duration, and even a little bit of an implementation scheme at the end, although it was rather brief. One of the reasons that we're taking a look back at that statement, that roadmap now is, well, for one thing, we're curious as to how much research has actually been done, whether or not it relates to anything that was in the roadmap. We also have some activities that have been going on for the past 5 years, at least at an increased intensity. One of them is obviously the meetings and the other activities of the bridge preservation partnerships, where they exchange ideas, establish working groups, even conduct small research activities like they did in the Northeast on the Small Movement Joints project. And in virtually every one of the meetings, they do address at some level or another a way of identifying what their particular research priorities would be. And then the other aspect of all that is that I think industry is up their game in terms of involvement in the preservation area, and obviously they're very strongly represented at every one of these meetings. So there's a new perspective coming into the process of determining what high priority research needs might be. And the other element here is now, obviously most of these groups have existed for a while, but I think the level of intensity of the activities and identification and projection of research needs has increased significantly over the last 5 years or so. And then finally, there is such a thing now as a it's a pavement and bridge preservation research database, which was created, and on the bridge side, we populated that with about 800 research studies. I would generally say they're within this century when they were completed, and many of them are new within the past, or completed within the past 4 or 5 years. If someone wanted to research or to query that database, you can just go to the NCPP website, and it's right there, middle depth, right on the right-hand side, and you can query that on different topic areas, different keywords, and find out what's in that database that relates to your particular issue. Now, what we did in session 2, we did most of the activities in breakout groups. There were 5 breakout groups, as you see here. Each one of them had a couple of facilitators to crack the whip and keep them on the agenda. Each one of the breakout groups had about roughly 15 to 16 people in them, and there was representation from Federal Highway, DOTs, industry, et cetera. So it was pretty well-rounded representation. In advance of the meeting, everybody was given a homework assignment. I I have to say, I can't say that everybody did their homework assignment, but it was a relatively simple one. We gave each one of the groups 5 topic statements from the roadmap, asked them to give them a little bit of a review, and then during their session, their live breakout session, asked them to discuss those statements, and then individually, each one of the participants in the group was asked to rate that problem statement on the basis of whether or not they felt it was still important and relevant, all the way from 0, meaning, well, it's just not that important anymore, all the way up to 6. And then to provide any random comments they might have about the statement itself, whether or not it needs to be refocused or anything that really came to their mind about that statement. When we got all done with that, I did some statistical analysis of the ratings that I got out of the Northeast Bridge Preservation Partnership. And one of my objectives was to try to go back and compare that with the rankings that were included in that roadmap document. Unfortunately, it was a little bit like comparing apples to oranges, but I think I can draw some general conclusions from the ratings that were given by the Northeast participants about those 25 statements. This is the bottom 10 of those statements. But what I was, first of all, indicating in this first slide here is that 15 of the 25 statements that were in the old roadmap received an average score of 4 or higher. So 0 is not important at all, 6 is very important, so 4 is a relatively high score. So that was kind of satisfying that those statements are still considered important and relevant. A couple of other conclusions that I could reach. Actually, if you looked at the rankings in 2008 and 2015, 8 of the top 10 statements that were rated by the Northeast group were also in the top 10 of the 2008. So the relative rankings really haven't changed that much. In fact, there were only, I think, a half a dozen statements that either went up or down 5 ranking spots. So relatively speaking, I think the evaluation of those statements was roughly the same as it was in 2008. Okay, that was one element of the session. The second element of the session that was done in the breakout groups was we asked each one of those groups to take their topic area, there were 5 of them, and I'll show you them in a minute, and just brainstorm about what they felt in the Northeast were the research priorities related to their topic area. And when they got all done with that, of course, they came back to the group to report out on what their findings were. I'm not going to make any particular commentary on any of these. I just want to provide you some examples of what the 5 groups came up with in regards to suggested high priority research topic areas. And you can really read them yourself without me fumbling through the topic areas. But we did assign one of the groups joints, and out of notice here, if you notice the middle one, they're suggesting a matrix similar to the deck matrix for joints. And we talked a lot late yesterday afternoon, Drew and several others talked about a database of information on products for preservation. This would obviously fall into that same category there. In the deck area, they seem to mainly be focusing in on what can you do during design to foster preservation without any kind of follow-up area of activity in the future, maintenance-wise. So I think that's probably an issue that has been sort of understudied, and I agree with the need there. And then they suggested something about quality inspection practices. Superstructure area, nothing really surprising here. Corrosion is always a problem. The one that kind of stood out from the rest of them is actually building the potential for jacking the bridge into the design and the construction, so it would make it, future maintenance would be considerably easier. Asset management, talk about deterioration, doing comparisons of what the various states are doing, etc. Then finally, in the substructure area, we had some suggestions again for research that would fit the needs of the Northeast Bridge Preservation Partnership states. Now, as you can probably imagine, these are just raw ideas. They really haven't been developed beyond this point. We only did this a couple of weeks ago, and we haven't really asked the group to even go through get the total number, but there were, let's say there's 20 priority areas that they came up with. We haven't done anything in the way of ranking that either, trying to come up with some kind of a reasonable process so I can query all the people that were there without really burdening them with a lot of work to maybe boil this down to a smaller list. Going to be doing that in the next couple of months. And then the third part of that session was we came back together as a general group to discuss the priorities that were identified and talk about the possibility of actually establishing a Northeast Partnership Research Needs Working Group. What's next? In the Northeast, we did decide that we would organize a research working group. So I'm going to be recruiting several people from the partnership there to get involved in a research group that essentially would be aimed at identifying priorities and then maybe developing those priorities into more complete project statements. I do want to get some kind of a ranking of the statements, even though it'll, statistically it probably won't be as sound as you would like it, but we at least have some kind of feeling as to what they consider the absolute highest priority was. And then develop some research problem statements and eventually communicate those needs to the other partnerships, which I'm kind of doing in a small way right now, to SCOM, to SCOBS, to the TRB Preservation Committee, to try to generate support for one or more of those studies to ultimately be funded. And then the other thing I'm trying to do is convince the other partnerships to do something similar. Some of them already have research working groups like the Midwest, and this is sort of a small effort to put some input into the working group. And I noticed about 7 or 8 people signed up on the work group sheet out there, which is, the last time I saw was the leader in the clubhouse is a number of volunteers, so that was kind of encouraging. The Southeast is going to conduct somewhat of a similar session. I don't believe we'll go through the ranking of the 2008 statements, but the idea would be to generate through brainstorming their ideas on what priority research is, and the West is going to do the same thing. So what I'm hoping is ultimately this all will coalesce into a national working group on research needs, and that working group would again communicate with the other bodies that have some influence on funding of research, that's SCOM and AASHTO, AHD 37, et cetera, to ultimately get some of these studies funded. And then also if we identify some small projects that could be done at a fairly small sum of money, like the Northeast Joint Study was done by Delaware. I wanted to say Drexel, but it wasn't Drexel. $10,000 to get a pretty good study on small movement joints in the Northeast. It was done by a grad student who did an excellent job. He's made some good presentations about it, et cetera. So we could generate some small research projects amongst the partnerships or by the 4 partnerships combined. So that's where we're going with this right now. And with that, if there's any questions or comments, I'll pass them over to Ed.
The oversight panel has decided, as I mentioned before, on those small research projects to accept proposals where they will fund 50% of them. They're going to be looking at both pavement and bridge proposals. And the amount of funding will depend on how much surplus funds they actually have each year.
The question I have deals with kind of the things that these working groups are going to do. Is part of the task that they're going to do is kind of look at what current research is out there also?
Current research has been done?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out an easy way to do that because I mentioned we have like 800 studies that have some relation. So I wouldn't expect anybody to volunteer to look through all those. So I'm trying to find a way to, maybe I could make some kind of a summary of you know, the real key research that's been done in 6 or 8 areas, and then recommend that to them as a resource. Yeah.
So I think we have to consider whether or not you want to have a whole session next year during our meeting next year. But I think all the other 3 have decided now.
Yeah, it
have
could
a
be as
session.
short as like a breakout session we've been doing this week here, an hour and a half or so, and we might even be able to feed them like more information on what's already been done, because that was one of the drawbacks to that session there. We didn't have anything to present to them. Here's what's already been done, so keep that in mind. Well, thank you all. It's been good being here with you. I got to run out in a few minutes, but it was a good meeting, and we certainly appreciate the hosts' states setting us up and everybody else who was involved, so good deal.